Today we have Mary Ellen Lepionka, who's going to be presenting for us today. She has a lot of material to go over, so I'm going to quickly do an intro and pass it off to her. Mary Ellen is of Gloucester. She's a retired anthropologist, college instructor, author, and textbook editor who has been researching the archaeology and early history of Cape Ann and Essex County from the last ice age to around 1700. This is a passion project for her based on her own intellectual curiosity. And from her commitment to this work, her work has appeared in the bulletin of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, CapeAnnHistory.org, EnduringGloucester.com, and HistoricIpswich.org. And if you haven't figured it out yet, she's also my mother. So I'm very happy to have her doing this great presentation with us.
Oh, wonderful. Hello, thank you. I'm really looking forward to this. And I have a lot to say, so I'm just going to start right in with the slide presentation. Let's see, this is it here. There we are. Now, let me see, I'm going to take away all these pictures. There we are. So now you should all just be seeing slides. And I want to just start by saying that the Algonquians who lived here at the time of European contact were the Pawtucket. They were a branch of the Pennacook, and they had their roots in the lower Merrimack Valley of New Hampshire. All the people named on this map were Algonquians, which is the name of a language family. And the Eastern Algonquian-speaking people occupied the eastern seaboard from all the way from the Arctic to Chesapeake Bay by around 3,000 years ago. Other people were here before them, but they were not farmers like the Pawtucket and the other Algonquians of southern New England. On Cape Ann, each Pawtucket family had a garden at their summer camp on the shore. They walked out of their wigwams right into their gardens. And as front yard growers, they had the same concerns as we do. They had to think about soil, sun, water, crop protection, and seed. And their gardening methods and ours are similar in many ways. As you'll see, they augmented the soil. They started some plants early from seed. They planted in raised beds. They planted according to the cardinal directions so that tall plants would not shade short ones. They planted on contour lines. They did companion planting. They conserved moisture in their gardens, and they watered without irrigation. I assume most of you water without irrigation. They used mulch. They made second plantings later in the season. They had to protect their gardens from deer and crows, and maybe also gophers, which is my problem. They practiced crop rotation. They planted cover crops, and they saved seed. So they did all these things. And they also protected the stands of wild plants and groves of shrubs and trees that they depended on to augment their diet with nuts and fruits and berries, bark, and fiber. This is Samuel de Champlain's map of Gloucester Harbor in 1606. You've probably seen this. You can see the domed Pawtucket wigwams in the parkland that they created through their forestry methods. Some of the wigwams have smoke coming out of the smoke holes from the hearths. Each wigwam has a garden in its front yard. The front yards are all southeast or southwest facing. Those gardens are in Fisherman's Field, Freshwater Cove, along Mill River, at the top of the harbor, on the back shore off of Little Good Harbor. And in East Gloucester, you can see their groves of managed forest and the causeway they built to Rocky Island, which was an island before they built a causeway to it. Champlain estimated that around 200 people were living on the harbor that summer. Based on information in the earliest Indian deeds, for yearly subsistence, a family really only needed 3 or 4 acres of land with arable soil and access to forest, fresh water, fish, and shellfish. They were fishers and clam diggers as well as farmers. In fact, Champlain rejected Gloucester as a possible capital for New France, he wrote in his diary, because the Pawtucket were wedded to fishing and farming and could not be persuaded to get into fur trapping. 100 years after Champlain's map was made, enslaved African youths were working on Nathaniel Coit's farm on Eastern Point. Coit's farm became Stevens Farm and later Plummer's Farm, and this 1830 map shows Plummer's Farm in red. Then you have Wanson's Farm in Cripple Cove in the Sayward Street area. And then you have the Big Town Farm in yellow. That was the original site of Gloucester Plantation. And before that was Pawtucket Cornfields. Then going east to west in West Gloucester, you have Coffin's Farm, Cole's Farm, and Haskell's Farm. And in Rockport to down by Great Pond is Manning Farm, and then the Babson Farm in Rockport. The Babson family owned most of the land between Andrews Point in Rockport and Lobster Cove in Annisquam, including much of Dogtown. In 1830, the descendants of slaves were still working on these farms. From 1700 well into the 19th century, enslaved and freed Africans and indigenous people were working Cape Ann farms and orchards and tending Cape Ann livestock. They removed rocks, plowed fields, carted manure and seaweed to spread on the soil, and they baled salt marsh hay. Settler families here typically had only 1 or 2 servants if they could afford them, and 2 to 4 slaves serving as field hands or farm hands, and more hands were sublet from others for harvests. The fastest growth in slavery here was between 1700 and 1750, but even then, only around 18% of Cape Ann slaves were engaged in farming. Slave labor was more important in the maritime industries and associated trades. Cape Ann merchants, ship owners, and sea captains supplied food to slave plantations all around the world. They also engaged in the slave trade and relied on raw materials produced by slave labor, even after the slave trade had been made illegal. Before the Civil War, Cape Ann's entire wealth was built directly and indirectly on the international slave trade. The majority of people on Cape Ann were opposed to the abolition of slavery. They voted that each state should be free to decide for themselves if they want slaves or not. When the slave trade was abolished, some Cape Anners petitioned the state legislature to prevent any more people of color from coming to live in Massachusetts. Massachusetts did not abolish slavery as an institution until after the Civil War with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. Before the English settled on Cape Ann, in addition to the summer camps of the individual Pawtucket families, such as those living on Gloucester Harbor when Champlain was here, the Pawtucket also had villages with as many as 20 or 30 wigwams grouped together. Village size always varied depending on the season of the year, and the village in Gloucester was in Riverview, just north of Pole Hill, and it was said to have had as many as 20 wigwams around Heron Pond in the summer times. The name of the village was Wanasqueguam, which means end of the salt marsh. The great marsh that starts north of Newburyport ends at the Annisquam River. The colonists called the village Wanasquam, and Pawtucket people lived there until 1686. Pawtucket history here, which we have not been told about and which has been expunged from local public records, is another whole story, which we can't get into because we're talking about gardens. In addition to family gardens, the Pawtucket villagers developed expanses of cultivated land for larger scale agriculture of their cereal crop, which was maize or corn. And their cornfields were in Riverdale, Between Grant Circle and Captain Hook's, all along Washington Street, from Oak Grove Cemetery to Poplar Street, Reynard Street, Cherry Street on the floodplains of Mill River, Alewife Brook, and the lower slopes of Dogtown. Governor John Endicott wrote in 1628 that he had bought and leased the Indians' hoed land north of the harbor as a site for Gloucester plantation. So the oldest sections of Gloucester were Pawtucket cornfields. They are under the middle school and its parking lots and playing fields, under the Public Works Department on Poplar Street, under Veterans Way, under the new extension of the Cape Ann Museum. On the oldest maps, the original name of Middle Street was Cornhill Street. In Rockport, the Pawtucket had cornfields on the terrace above Old Garden Beach and down as far as the Rockport Golf Club. That name, Old Garden, is on the earliest maps and refers to the gardens of the indigenous people that the colonists found here. These are the sites with evidence of Pawtucket farming, with the large areas indicating cultivated land for cornfields. There were growers all around Gloucester Harbor, Mill River, Alewife Brook, Little Good Harbor River, Jones River behind Wingersheek Beach and Coffin's Beach, Lobster Cove in Annisquam, Mill Brook in Rockport, Tobacco River in Essex, and on Sawmill Brook in Manchester by the Sea. And I'm sure there are others, but those are the only ones I've found so far. The Pawtucket did not farm in Dogtown, which is a glacial moraine and was treeless for most of its existence. But early colonists did. They cut down the few trees that remained in the interior of the Cape, and they plowed and planted among the rocks. By 1700, the soil would no longer support even family subsistence farming, and Dogtown was converted to pastures for cattle and sheep. By 1800, overgrazing made Dogtown untenable even for livestock, and the common settlement was abandoned soon afterwards. We still see the cellar holes of the houses of the 3 generations of people who lived there. By 1900, Dogtown supported only a few milk cows and hogs. In the 1700s and 1800s, the colonist farms on Cape Ann typically produced the staple crops that are listed here, along with livestock products and fibers for weaving. The multi-purpose use of domesticated animals, cattle, oxen, and sheep in particular, and the fencing of farms and pastures were the main differences between colonial settlements and indigenous and agrarian settlements. Manuring the fields enabled the colonial farmers to continuously plant in the same ground year after year. The Pawtucket did not have manure or compost. They did not keep livestock. The Northeast has never had domesticable animals in the wild. The Pawtucket sometimes fertilized their kitchen gardens with fish waste, especially lobster bodies and the bodies of horseshoe crabs, and alewives, which are river herrings after their spawning in spring, kind of today's Neptune's harvest. But carrying buckets of fish slurry to the cornfields was not practical, and they risked attracting carnivores that would dig up the crop to get at the fish. And that's exactly what happened at Plymouth when the colonists over-fertilized with fish, which was a strategy intended only for emergencies. Bounties on marauding wolves were among the very first laws enacted at the first plantations in Plymouth, Ipswich, Newbury, and Gloucester. The Pawtucket had to cultivate much more land than they put into production at any given time. They did this to build up the soil quality and to have enough ground for future planting, because corn, as you probably know, is a very heavy nitrogen feeder. It depletes the soil within 2 or 3 plantings. Organic nitrogen gets into the soil mainly from animal and plant decomposition, as in applications of manure or deposits of alluvial soils on the floodplains of rivers. And there are some plants like peas and beans that actually help to fix nitrogen in the soil. The bacteria in the soil convert the nitrogen to nutrients that plants can use. And the plants then take up those nutrients, mainly ammonium and nitrate, through their roots. Other than corn, you have beets, kale, lettuce, parsley, spinach, and tomato, and they all take up nutrients faster than the soil can replenish itself. There are only 3 ways to deal with this situation. You can add fertilizer, you can let the ground fallow long enough to recover its fertility naturally, or you can find new ground to plant in. To recover soil fertility, the Pawtucket let some fields go fallow. On others, they planted cane bamboo as a cover crop, attractive to deer, and otherwise they just kept clearing new land, and they did this by the slash and burn method. Indigenous people around the world today still practice slash and burn agriculture, which is also called swidden agriculture. It seems destructive, but actually slash and burn is only destructive when forests are clear cut, which leads to erosion and causes pollution of soil and water. The Algonquians did not clear cut. They kept windbreaks, they kept groves of trees, and they kept cane breaks between their cornfields. You can still see native wild bamboo can breaks along undeveloped sections of highway around here, wherever Algonquians farmed in the Northeast. For slash and burn, the Pawtucket chose the gentle southwest-facing slopes of hillsides, and they planted along contour lines perpendicular to the direction of groundwater flow. They did not practice irrigation, so optimal use of rainwater and groundwater were important. And to guide planting, they often erected stones to mark the location, width, and direction of groundwater flows. And if you watch your yard after every rainfall in spring now, when the water table is highest, you can see where your groundwater comes from and where it goes. You can also tell where your most naturally moist areas are by observing plant growth, because where there's more moisture, the grass or the plants will be more luxuriant. In my yard, this was taken a few years ago. I'm afraid my yard's terribly overgrown now. But my groundwater comes from exposed bedrock behind my shed and from a ledge in a hill to the east. The largest flow runs east to west through my yard. The circle is, in the lower one, is shows where my frost hollow is. And the frost hollow is the one place in any yard where the ground is first to freeze and the snow is the last to melt. So if I were a Pawtucket farmer planting maize, I would arrange my corn rows like this on a slope perpendicular to the area with the greatest groundwater flow. And ideally, if I had a choice, I would arrange this on a more southwest facing slope to maximize sunlight and minimize shading. And I would clear more growth from around my cornfield. Also, I would not plant anything in my frost hollow. The Pawtucket also selectively drained beaver ponds to plant in the rich lacustrine soil. They did not have much opportunity to plant on the floodplains of rivers here. Our rivers don't flood predictably to deposit new soil over a wide area. They're apt to flood catastrophically and erode soils away. And then our streams and rivers tend to dry up before the growing season is over. Our bigger rivers are tidal rivers, too salty, and salt marshes and freshwater swamps also will not support maize agriculture. Because the Indians cultivated much more land than they planted, the colonists saw them as wasteful, an excuse to appropriate their land. But the Pawtucket were mobile farmers. They moved their crops to new or renewed fields, and then they just moved their villages to be nearer to wherever they had planted in a given year. The richness and diversity of resources in Essex County favored seasonal migration and mobile farming. That's why the people here did not build permanent structures or cities like their relatives did in Central and South America. The English colonists often claimed that the Pawtucket were abandoning their villages when they were only moving them, another excuse to take their land. Slash and burn adds nutrients to the forest soils, especially potassium from the wood ashes or potash. And the Pawtucket would rake up the potash into the soil into heaps or mounds between the tree stumps. Eventually, the tree stumps could be removed, and there would be a field of little hills to plant in someday. Before planting, the women would keep raking up the new mounds after every rainfall to build up moisture in the mound, and they would keep compacting the ground between the mounds. This meant that the mounds could freely drain, but the ground would retain moisture. They also would add crushed shell to the mounds to sweeten our acid soil and to stabilize sandy soil. And sometimes they would even transport soil in baskets to make planting beds in layers 10 or 12 inches deep, right on top of shell middens, the shell heaps that they made from discarded shellfish harvesting. The colonists later mined these shell middens to make lime. For example, at Wheeler's Point, the entire end of Wheeler's Point is a giant shell heap from around 800 to 1,000 years of Pawtucket occupation. There are imported planting beds of black earth on top of shell heaps on Great Neck in Ipswich and behind the dunes at Coffin's Beach in West Gloucester. And there are remains of cornhill rows preserved on the fringes of old Indian reservations, such as this one in Lowell, which was called Wemisit. The Pawtucket who came to Cape Ann in summers wintered in Wemisit, which was also abandoned for the last time in around 1686. In addition to slash and burn agriculture, the Algonquians also set controlled fires twice a year to clear the undergrowth in the groves that they were protecting. This would create grassy clearings as a habitat for deer and heaths for berry bushes. Controlled burning also kept the trails clear and sightlines clear for travel and for safety from surprise enemy attacks. Many explorers remarked on the stretches of open parkland they saw along the coast and river valleys. Controlled burns also allowed the most desirable trees to grow to greater size for fruit and nut harvests, wigwam covering bark, medicinal bark, and birch bark canoes. You need big trees for those things. Here's what the Pawtucket grew in their raised beds in their family gardens. Gardening and anything to do with plants was strictly women's work. The women would sprout seed corn with damp clay and leather bags and plant the slips in the mounds as seedlings. This reduced the risk of germination failure and also reduced the risk of damping off on cold nights. You know how our springtimes go here. When the corn plants were 4 or 5 inches high, they direct sowed beans around the edges of the mound. And a week or two after that, they direct sowed the summer and winter squash. This companion planting of corn, squash, and beans is called the Three Sisters method. The beans had corn stalks to climb, and the squashes shaded the corn plant's roots to keep them cool. Let's take a closer look at some of these things. But the people didn't bother to grow other staple crops in their mounds, like cucumbers and peas and potatoes, because these were all very abundant in the wild here. Maize was domesticated in northern Mexico more than 8,000 years ago and was carried to the northeast by the eastern woodland Indians, including the Algonquians. They invented many varieties of corn, including popcorn, and early maturing varieties for places with short growing seasons. They developed varieties needing fewer days to harvest by saving the kernels from the first ears to form at the bottom of the stalks to use as seed corn for the following year. Corn is wind pollinated And the Pawtucket did not select for color as the colonists did. All corn of any color has the same nutritional value, but some varieties are better for eating green and others for grinding to flour. As a hedge against corn crop failure, the Algonquians also collected edible wild seeds, including northern wild rice, which still grows in the Ipswich River. And they made acorn meal and nut flours as well. This black and white inset shows a Pawtucket woman. She's grinding corn in a mortar made out of a hollowed tree trunk. And this picture was made by Samuel de Champlain's artist. He saw her right here on Cape Ann in 1606. So the people were growing maize on the gentle slopes of southwest facing uplands cleared through slash and burn. In this artist's representation, the women and children are harvesting green corn for July for the Green Corn Festival. And some crookneck squashes have been left on the ground to harden into gourds, which were hollowed out and used as water jugs and drinking cups. The boy on the platform, he's doing his stint as a scarecrow. He has a small arsenal of stones up there to throw at the crows. And later would be the fall harvest of corn left on the stalks to dry. They stored dried corn cobs and other preserved foods in underground caches for use in trade and winter meals. These are the kinds of tools that the women used for gardening. The women used shell and stone attached to bone or wooden handles. These artifacts all come from Cape Ann. The simplest tool was a dibble stick for poking holes in the ground. Stone hoes and mattocks were hafted at right angles to wooden handles. The leg bone of a deer could make a good handle to turn any big hen clam or surf clam into a trowel. Shoulder blades and antlers of moose made good shovels, also hand plows, also rakes, and they also used them for clam forks. The women used various stones to braid vegetables for rubbing the kernels off of the dried corn cobs. They also ground corn in stone corn mills as well as in hollowed tree trunks. Used stone mortars and pestles, mullers, and nutters or hammerstones for cracking nuts. They grew pumpkins, squashes, including acorn squash, all of which are native to New England. They also grew native summer squashes such as crookneck yellow and a variety of zucchini, also a kind of melon that's in the watermelon family, and beans. The beans that are native to New England include pinto, kidney, and pea or navy beans, and you can still find them naturalized, growing wild here on Cape Ann. Jerusalem artichokes with their cheery yellow, sort of daisy-like flowers were cultivated for their tubers. The colonists gave them that name because Samuel de Champlain had written that the tubers tasted like artichokes, and the colonists thought that New England was supposed to be the new Jerusalem. So they're called Jerusalem artichokes. And wherever they haven't been planted intentionally recently for landscaping, they mark the sites of ancient Algonquian gardens. Common sunflower is native to New England. Sunflower seeds were roasted and ground to make a beverage. The leaves could be dried and smoked, and the Algonquians hulled and crushed the seeds to add to dishes or to press for oil. We have two native tobacco plants here that are native to New England, Nicotiana rustica and Nicotiana alata. They're narrow-leaved varieties. The Algonquians combined Nicotiana leaves with other substances for smoking, which was a spiritual practice. Inhaling smoke was a way to experience the divine. Exhaling it was a way to send prayers to the spirit world. Tobacco was one of the 4 sacred plants. Even before the domestication of maize, the indigenous people were cultivating seed-bearing and edible leaf plants, such as marsh elder and the chenopodiums. Chenopodiums include amaranth and goosefoot, also called lamb's quarters. They have edible leaves and they produce a grain that's similar to quinoa. Dried seeds of marsh elder, goosefoot, and amaranth were often ground together as flour to use as a thickener or to use in baking. And amaranth also has medicinal uses, very high in vitamin C, and infusions of the leaves and flowers in teas were used to treat various ailments. They also added dried amaranth leaves to their tobacco mixtures, along with dried sumac leaves, shaved chokecherry bark, the sunflower seeds, along with the native nicotiana. Signs other than wild sunflowers and chenopodiums that you might have come across a Pawtucket garden include these plants growing in proximity: deer tongue lettuce, wild onions, plantains, docks, and native wild arugula. Dock leaves are high in vitamins A and C, protein, and iron. The young leaves can be boiled or steamed or sauteed like spinach. The tap roots of dock and plantain are edible cooked. And later, the bitter white resin in the mature leaves of these plants was used medicinally. And then at the end of the season, the people collected the seeds from these plants to mix with other wild grains and to grind into flour. A lot of the plants that the Algonquians protected or grew were multi-purpose plants and could be used in different ways in different seasons. These are just a few of the medicinal and culinary herbs and flowers that the Pawtucket nurtured. Sweetgrass is one of the 4 sacred plants used in ceremonies. The others are sage, cedar, and, as I mentioned, tobacco. Bedstraw seeds were roasted and boiled for a beverage, and the leaves had medicinal use. It's a real nuisance in the garden, this bedstraw, because it's sticky and grows all over everything. But the indigenous people encouraged the growth of it because it was a favorite forage of deer. Colonists stuffed their mattresses with it, hence the name. Elderberry, strawberry leaves, speedwell or veronica, nightshade, and mint are examples of plants that were important in medicine. For example, purple nightshade is a poison, but in moderation, it is also anti-inflammatory, a muscle relaxant, and a pain reliever. The Pawtucket gave it to women to ease the pain of childbirth. Wow. They used goldenrod flowers to flavor and color their porridges and puddings. I have another whole presentation on the wild plants that the Algonquians gathered here for food and medicine. But let's get back to gardens. Some Pawtucket families, especially healers, grew medicinal and aromatic herbs and flowers in medicine wheel gardens. Algonquian healing was based on concepts relating to earth balance and spiritual health. Earth balance depended on open communication between the earth, the water world below, and the sky world above. The earth is represented by the circle, which represents the turtle shell, because Earth is Turtle Island, the world having been created on the back of a turtle with mud from the bottom of the water world. So the medicine wheel is divided into 4 quadrants based on the 4 cardinal directions. Circle is the earth, the water world is below, and the sky world is above. In the middle of the garden was a spirit tree or some symbol of spiritual power or Manitou. It could be a tree, a pole, a boulder, some kind of sun symbol, sculpture, or some other feature representing the creator spirit. Each quadrant is associated with a season of the year, a color, a stage of life, a state of mind, and plants and animals emblematic of those things in those seasons. For example, north is associated with winter, the color white, old age and respect for elders, contemplation, cedar as a sacred plant, the bear as a sacred animal, and the wind as a sacred source of Manitou. And everything that you planted in that quadrant would relate in some way to those qualities. There are a few examples of what one might plant in each quadrant. There are many options for different choices in keeping with the main themes. In the north, for example, in addition to the things listed, your plantings could include sunflowers, echinacea, motherwort, fleabane, false goat beard, which is a native astilbe, and native grasses. In the east, your plants for tea leaves could include bee balm, strawberry, lemon balm, lemon verbena, mint, red clover, native rose, and so on. And there's lots of room for creative expression there. Medicine wheel gardens can be family gardens or community gardens of any size, marked out with any materials. It might be fun for backyard growers to build one. There are many ways to express this concept, and there are plant lists for what one might include in each quadrant. A medicine wheel garden might be a good way to acknowledge the history of indigenous people here for Gloucester's 400th anniversary in 2023. Some gardeners use the medicine wheel concept just for flowers by color: white, yellow and orange, red and pink, blue and purple. The flowers and flowering ground covers on this list are native to New England and can still be found growing wild here as well as in your backyards. If you wanted to create an indigenous themed flower garden, these would be the plants to use. You can also grow native vegetables using stock from organic heirloom seed companies. You just have to keep in mind that many so-called heirloom varieties are European in origin. Even very common plants like dandelions, asparagus, foxglove, honeysuckle, bleeding heart, all turn out to have been imported. The Algonquians preserved the food that they grew and gathered by various methods. They stored dried maize, various types of flour, dried berries, fruit leathers, dried beans and peas, nuts, dried and fermented vegetables, dried clam meats and fish flakes, and meat jerkies or pemmigans. And corn was their basic ingredient for everything. These are their methods for food preparation and preservation, and sun drying was often the first step. Rotten green corn was regarded as a delicacy, sort of like a 1,000-year-old egg. They cooked food on heated rocks in the hearth, in pots, in basket steamers, and on the fire, barbecue style. Until they got metal pots from Europeans, they boiled liquids by dropping fire-heated rocks into animal bladders or hollow logs that contained the liquid. They did not use closed ovens, but baked in fire pits. They would encase a fish in clay and put the whole thing into the fire on a plank. When the plank burned and the clay was baked, the fish was done, and breaking off the clay would take off all the scales with it, and the cook would be perfectly cooked and easily filleted. The traditional Algonquian clam bake was built in these layers. First, you had fire-heated rocks in a pit dug into the sand. Then you put on top of them a layer of damp seaweed, which created steam. Then the second layer was clams and mussels or other shellfish. Then you had chopped vegetables in layer 3. Then in layer 4, you had flat fish flakes, and they preferred haddock or flounder, and also thinly sliced meat, especially venison. And the 5th layer were lobsters and crabs. The 6th layer had corn in the husk. And then on top of that, another layer of damp seaweed. And then the whole mound was covered over with mats. The mats were woven from corn stalks and cattail leaves. They sealed in the heat and steam, making an oven. This kind of baking was done for community meals and on special occasions. Families competing for rank put on extravagant clam bakes. Having an indigenously authentic clam bake might be a nice thing to include in an end of season harvest celebration. Here's a few recipes. Nossamp was cornmeal, berries, crushed nuts and seeds with water and syrup to sweeten. No cake was a trail food with parched corn, just ground to a powder, and then you mixed it with whatever you found on the trail and mixed it with water, berries, raisins, nuts, or anything else. Succotash is boiled kernels of green corn, peas, and beans. Sabaheg, dry beans, corn in the form of hominy grits, meat, water, green beans, winter squash, nut and seed flour for thickener, dried onion, clam juice, and bay leaves or honey locust pods for flavoring. And Three Sisters stew was just corn, beans with chunks of squash. Bannock is a cornmeal fritter fried in hot animal dough. Squash blossoms and any other large flowers that are edible were dipped in a thin tempura-like batter and deep fried in oil. The male flowers of squashes, you pick them to encourage the fruits. That's what they would do with them. Hickory nut pudding was flavored with goldenrod flowers and nut paste mixed with cornmeal. Another pudding they made was with dried Concord grapes, which are essentially raisins, cornmeal, nut butter, June berries, honey, and wild ginger root. Nut pumpkin cake was also cornmeal based, and they, of course, added cranberries to everything. If you go online, it's hard to find native recipes that are authentic. You have to ignore or substitute for any recipes that call for baking powder, baking soda, molasses, any dairy product, or sugar. And watch out for recipes with the word Indian. So-called Indian pudding, for example, is British colonial, made with molasses and milk. And the only thing Indian about it is the cornmeal on which it's based. These are some sources that you might want to look at. Nativeseeds.org has a good tutorial on 3-seed gardening, and I recommend these books, which are written by Native Americans. The one most relevant to Cape Ann has as its co-author Joseph Bruchac, who is Abenaki, and he includes the folklore that goes with the plants. Almost all of the edible plants have some kind of story, legend, or a bit of folklore that goes with them. Kavash is an ethnobotanist and also has books on healing ways and medicine wheel gardens. There's a lot of information on making medicine wheels. There are also very good foraging guides for finding food in the wild. Some of the indigenous recipe books and gardening books are based on the kinds of plants that don't grow here. They grow in the South or the West, or they come from other indigenous cultures. But there is a lot of overlap. For example, someone gave me a cookbook that's cleverly called The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. And it has recipes that the Pawtucket here would have been able to make just as well as the Lakota Sioux out west. So that's basically all I have to say for you today. My email address is at the bottom of this screen, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if the time runs out and your question hasn't been addressed. Then I'll be glad to answer any question by email. So I guess I now am supposed to stop share so that questions can be asked. There. Back.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mary Ellen. So I encourage everybody to pop any questions that they've got into the chat. We have about 10 more minutes, so plenty of time for anything that you're curious about. I know that we've got one already, actually from Molly Hardy. And Molly has just said, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, that there's so much important and valuable information here. And Molly's especially intrigued by what you said about helianthus as a sign of a Pawtucket garden. And she's wondering if you could offer any other examples of reading the land to tell us something about the past, a past that is often elided in the written historical record.
Well, these are indigenous landscapes all around us. And aside from plants that might give a clue, there are also rocks. And there are a lot of configurations of rocks that have been moved or modified that are expressions of Algonquian culture or Pawtucket culture that are around here. An example is on Pole Hill, for example, and there are many other places. So if you look around and realize that any part of the landscape that has not been developed or that it was not changed significantly since colonial times, the native people who lived here saw the same things. So, and I'll be glad to talk to Molly more. I met Molly when she was with the Cape Ann Museum. So let's get in touch, Molly.